Okay, well, thank you everyone for your patience. We had a slight bit of technical issues, but we should be streaming wide and across the web. My name is Leah Walker. I'm a senior associate at the Institute for Security and Technology, and I am thrilled to be kicking off my morning with this panel with these three esteemed experts on averting catastrophe, walking the talk on nuclear risk reduction and crisis communications. We have three wonderful scholars here to talk to us today. I'm particularly excited that we have such useful perspectives given the past few weeks we've had. We have Dr. Tong Zhao, who is a visiting research scholar in the program on science and global security at Princeton University. We have Dr. Todd Sechser, who is the professor of politics and public policy at the University of Virginia. And we have Dmitry Stefanovich, who's a research fellow at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations. And Dr. Tong Zhao, Dr. Todd Sechser, and Dmitry Stefanovich are going to be sharing their perspectives on various approaches to moving forward crisis communications and risk reductions, with a particular attention to Russia and China, and also the impact that emerging technology has in this space. So I just want to kick it off by saying we are here hosted by the Institute for Security and Technology. The Institute for Security and Technology is a nonprofit research institute working at the intersection of technology and security, surprise, in the Bay Area. Part of our portfolio is additive crisis control and nuclear crisis communications. And as such, we work on a number of projects examining the role and the benefits of crisis communications as a risk reduction tool. So we're looking forward to discuss that further in this panel. And I want to kick it off with a few opening remarks from each of the panelists. We might as well go in the order that I introduced them, which would be Dr. Tong Zhao.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to talk about this topic of nuclear risk reduction and crisis communication. I think nuclear risk is at the core of the concept of nuclear deterrence. When a nuclear armed country feels that its core national interests are threatened, then it would have less will to actually reduce the risk. There will be greater will to actually manipulate the risk in order to maximize the coercive leverage of nuclear weapons. Because they fear that to reduce the risk would somehow embolden the enemy, make it safer for the enemy to continue its perceived provocations and aggressions. But I think we see some of these trends going on, perhaps in Russia, right? During the Ukraine war. We see that Russians' veiled nuclear threat is not necessarily to deter a nuclear attack, but to actually dissuade and deter U.S. and NATO countries from supporting Ukraine militarily, or from imposing crippling sanctions and political isolation against Russia. So it is also about deterring and reducing non-nuclear aggression. And in the case of China, if there is a war over Taiwan Strait with the United States, in case China is facing a conventional defeat, I think China would also feel a strong motivation to maximize the coercive leverage of nuclear weapons to deter non-nuclear threats. So I think this is a problem we face today. Countries like China, they don't have to, abandon their long-standing no first use policy, because they can issue an implicit nuclear threat without actually, explicitly threatening anyone with nuclear weapons, and still be able to achieve the coercive leverage of nuclear weapons. So the first challenge to reducing nuclear risk is the political will. That's my number one point. Second, I think in the case of China, we do see evolving Chinese views on the issue of escalation risk. Right? The traditional Chinese view is that nuclear escalation is very unlikely. conventional wars, are very hard to escalate across the nuclear threshold. But once the nuclear threshold is crossed, then it is very hard to control the escalation. It will always and perhaps very quickly escalate all the way to an all-out nuclear exchange. Professor Taylor Fravel and Fiona Cunningham and others have conducted excellent research on that traditional Chinese view. But I'm afraid this view may be changing as Chinese military strategies today think more and more about more complex scenarios of war fighting involving including nuclear weapons. For a long time, China has realized that its nuclear deterrence based on massive retaliation may be able to deter a massive nuclear attack, but it's not really credible to deter a limited nuclear threat. And this increasing imminent risk of nuclear war, of a military conflict over Taiwan, is further increasing the Chinese worry that the Chinese conventional superiority might put pressure on the United States to consider threatening nuclear escalation first in a conventional conflict with China. So in order to deal with that, China may need to have capabilities and postures that can manage this escalation at lower levels of a conflict. So here we have a situation in which US and China, both sides, I think, are increasingly pursuing and believing in escalation management. And that's a more dangerous situation than before. At least previously, China is relying on massive retaliation, doesn't really believe in escalation management. Because no one really has real experience of managing a nuclear escalation. So our confidence is not based on empirical data. So things can go terribly wrong when countries actually start to try to manage a nuclear escalation. The good news, however, is compared with other topics like arms control or nuclear transparency, nuclear risk reduction is still less sensitive to China to talk about. And China still has a strategic interest in avoiding a premature war with the US, including over the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese overall strategy appears to be that it will try to use the peaceful time to continue building its comprehensive military power so that eventually China doesn't need to fight to achieve the goal of unification with Taiwan. The pure coercive leverage of a formidable military power will help China achieve that goal peacefully. That means there is still, I think, opportunity to engage China on the topic of risk reduction and crisis communication to avoid unnecessary conflicts and inadvertent escalation. Last point, I think we still face some long-standing challenges, and these challenges are mostly internal. China has some unique internal dynamics, including its insistence that the military needs to be under tight control of the political party. And there is also longstanding suspicion about whether China's enemy might abuse or misuse a military hotline in a crisis to spread disinformation, to confuse China, etc. But we can discuss about those and more specific confidence building measures in following discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zhao. I think those were great comments. I am going to go a little bit rogue before we turn to Dmitry on the Russia side of things. I am curious, in your mind, what is the closest that China has gotten to being in a nuclear crisis? From the Chinese perspective, what do they see as the closest they've come to that area of concern, even if they haven't experienced it, as you were just saying, to the fullest degree?
I think the closest moment is actually in 1969 between China and Soviet Union, when they have some relatively serious border clashes. Soldiers died. And in the run-up to the Chinese national holiday, October the 1st, China was, Chinese senior leaders were genuinely worried about some Soviet preemptive attack on China, and they basically dispersed all senior Chinese leaders to different cities in China, and they moved up some previously scheduled nuclear tests to an earlier date, and hoped that this sudden and surprising nuclear test could somehow shock the enemy into not taking a pre-planned military action against China. So that, and that's also the first time China put its nuclear forces on higher alert. So I think that's one of the most dangerous moments in Chinese history, when China really felt the risk of nuclear conflict.
And then we will move to the others. So I apologize for my interruption, but were there any significant lessons learned from that in terms of avoiding a crisis, or was the aftermath more about ensuring strength to not find itself in that position once again? Was there any interest in reducing risk or increasing communication with the Soviets, or any sort of bilateral conversations, or was there much more of a focus on making sure such an event never happened again?
I think, looking back at that episode, clearly there was some serious Chinese misunderstanding and misinterpretation of Soviet intent, right? When the Soviet premier flew to Beijing to talk with Zhou Enlai, there is a serious concern that the Soviet might load that plane with soldiers and then would take over the Beijing airport as a surprise attack. And clearly the Chinese concern about a preemptive Soviet attack against the key Chinese, political leadership and military sites, including nuclear sites, in 1969 was also an overestimation of Soviet intent. In the open literature, unfortunately, I haven't seen much deep reflection on that episode and to try to learn lessons. Today, it appears that China is, very determined to pursue the option of reducing risk by building up one's unilateral power, because China believes that the source of the risk today comes from increasingly aggressive American military posture. And a greater Chinese power would help deter and contain that American aggressiveness. So because China has a different reading about what causes the risk, so it tends to rely more on unilateral build-up. But I still think there are important room for lessons to be learned about the importance of crisis communication.
Fantastic. That is such an interesting thread, and we will get further into that at the end of this event. But Dmitry, I'm sorry I've left you waiting. Please, I'd love to hear your opening remarks.
Well, no worries, and I'm happy to be here. I just say that what Tong Zhao just said is extremely important on so many levels. One is that it seems that a lot of risks emanates from the genuine fear of the decision makers, that the adversaries are having some sort of a cunning plan to destroy them. And we see it like in many cases in Moscow, in Washington, anywhere. And it comes from the nature of nuclear deterrence, because basically to deter someone, you need to frighten him. So this is quite an interesting topic. And actually it relates also to another thing on which I also haven't seen much literature in Russia, that while now we see American commanders and decision makers arguing that they've found themselves in a very dramatic situation of deterring two peer adversaries at once, well, the Soviet commanders and decision makers were in this situation for decades before the 90s, and under better circumstances, probably there could have been some very fancy transfer of knowledge. So back to my initial remarks, I would just say that, well, to put it in the most simple terms, the risks come from conflicting narratives and there is a continuous blame game. Who is responsible for the risks? At the same time, there can be like several ways of looking why there are nuclear risks that we are discussing how to reduce in the first place. One school of thought might argue that risks are created by the existence of nuclear and other strategic weapons themselves, as well as continuous emergence of disruptive technologies that affect this central stability. Another way of looking at is that well, risks are created by continuous increase of military, economical, and political pressure by some countries against other countries. And this pressure manifests itself in development and deployment of explicitly military assets closer to one's core territories. And there is also a third way to look at that well, risks are created by reckless behaviors by these countries. Now, how to address this stuff? Well, from my perspective, first and foremost, all these three outlooks, three ways of looking at risks have some truth to them. And those are impossible to be addressed in a vacuum. So we need to look at all three levels of risks if we genuinely want to reduce them. Because if we try to reduce one of those, we might end up even in a less stable environment. For example, if one side is sure that they can manage or even dominate escalation, and we've read quite a lot of publications on that in many different languages, arguing that it is actually possible because they have the upper military hand and robust deconflicting communications, then, well, they continuously test the so-called red lines of the adversaries because in any case, they will have more capabilities and they will have the communications to de-escalate in case something goes wrong. Well, if you switch sides, you understand that the very same actions might lead to overreaction, to put it in the most clear way. And overreaction may go all the way to nuclear escalation. And possibly this is not something that we want to see, because everything gets much more dramatic flavor if the main actors that are engaged in such relations are basically nuclear weapon states, and they have nuclear weapons for a reason. Although, of course, these reasons and the logic and doctrines might be quite different. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work perfectly. Risk reduction mechanisms have been developed and researched for quite a while, but well, those are imperfect. And one of the reasons why we see the tragedy that we are witnessing is basically that there was quite a number of misperceptions of risk-taking and beliefs in capability to manage escalation. Still, fortunately, it seems that everyone involved more or less are getting their act together and are becoming more and more careful. They're trying to think a few steps ahead about consequences. And well, we see that a lot of communication channels are being used these days. Well, let's hope that despite the very real, dramatic, tragic reality that we see, as a humankind, in our national and individual capacities, we will be able to actually reduce the risks after all, learning from what we see right now. And I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Fantastic, thank you. And I agree, it's been encouraging to see the amounts of communication that's happened throughout the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's been something that I've been watching, and seeing channels be used is often we get into the space of risk reduction, and there's often questions of can risk reduction actually do anything? And I do think that there's been encouraging evidence from the conflict that deep communication ties, no matter how at odds the countries may be, can be very useful in reassuring one another that one country isn't acting irrationally. And I think that's a really critical part of crisis communication, just showing that intent to communicate and that willingness to follow certain preordained protocols shows a sort of rationality of national mind that I think is somewhat reassuring, even if many other things are not. But that's wonderful. There is obviously a plethora of nuclear crises in which Russia and the Soviet Union found itself in, often with regards to the United States. I'm not going to ask you which was the most significant, which was the most risky. But I am curious, in your mind, which Soviet or Russian nuclear crisis most shaped Russian thinking today? Which was the most, in hindsight, concerning to them?
Well, it's actually a great question that doesn't have a definite answer, at least again from my perspective. I believe it was a continuous learning curve. Mm-hmm. Like we had first nuclear weapons use, then we have like Cuban Missile Crisis, we had Berlin Crisis, we had Suez Crisis, we had able archery, and then we had the dissolution of the Soviet Union and a lot of other things. And it was always learning. The problem is, I think right now, is that, and it's not exactly that I'm answering your question, but I think the problem that we have right now is that there is a very well embedded belief that at least some of the mechanisms used to, well, stabilize things, to de-escalate things between Soviet Union and the United States, and then between Russia and Federation and the United States, they were not reciprocal, that the US gained some advantage and, well, Moscow lost some advantage, found themselves in a disadvantageous position. And while in nuclear domain it's more complicated than that, I believe there is a very serious negative attitude to whatever is proposed initially. But at the same time, it seems that, again, if we look back at decades ago, whenever some idea comes up, or whether it's offered by the Americans or by Russians or by someone else, there is a very negative approach, because everyone just considers, as I've said earlier, that the adversary has some sort of a cunning plan to gain an advantage.
Yeah.
But then it turns out that, well, it might be useful, it might be a good mechanism, and we end up sometimes even switching sides, like, for example, with the missile defense and with the ABM treaty. So, yeah, what I'm very much sure about is that despite all the negative attitudes and the current dramatic situation, there is a very real learning process, and people learn from the mistakes. Sometimes the takeaways might be wrong, but in the end, the experience is being accumulated, and hopefully we will end up in a more stable situation eventually. I would also mention one good example that one of the latest examples that I very much like is that during this quite large exercise by NATO Navy and Air Force, the Baltops, over this summer in the Baltic Sea, there was like a lot of action, including some live fires and so on. And there was, of course, a parallel exercise by the Russian forces, and we saw no incidents at all. In general, we see that the number of incidents has decreased that we've seen previously, like near flights or something at the high seas. It decreased so dramatically that, well, we understand that people in uniform it turned out to be much more careful than the people wearing ties. Yes, and with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Agreed. And now, I'm sorry for my moderator intrusions, but Dr. Sechser, excited to hear from you now.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and it's great to see my colleagues here on this call. I was tasked with switching gears just a little bit and talking about emerging technologies and how we should think about the connection between technology and nuclear risk. So what I thought I'd do is first make some very general comments about my observations about what emerging technologies might do, or thinking about what emerging technologies might do to nuclear risk. And then talk about some more specific factors and questions that we should be thinking about when we're trying to connect those two ideas. I think my biggest observation is everybody is talking now about emerging technologies and disruptive technologies, not just in nuclear affairs, but in international relations more broadly. Anybody talking about defense or the military or foreign policy is inevitably coming across discussions about emerging technologies. And really the consensus is that many of these technologies will be, or at least have the potential to be, very disruptive, game changers in nuclear affairs. I haven't been on any panels or read any Defense Department reports that are all about why artificial intelligence doesn't matter, or why hypersonic weapons are irrelevant. The view is that these are major events, major technologies that will change the way that international relations is conducted. And I've also observed that the tenor of these discussions really tends toward the negative. People, I think, not just in the United States, but around the world, are really viewing emerging technologies with some unease. Again, nobody's out there talking about how emerging technologies will bring about a new golden age of nuclear deterrence and stability. People are talking about how technologies might undercut stability and create new risks of escalation or misperceptions. So that's one observation. I think, another observation is that this is not the first time the world has confronted new technologies. And I think there are a couple of historical realities that we should acknowledge when we're thinking about them and thinking about how they might alter nuclear risks. One is that very few technologies actually fundamentally reshape the strategic dynamics of defense or of international relations. Most new technologies are incremental advancements at most. Many of them are, what I think of as like the zip disks of international politics, if you're old enough to remember those. Well, a lot of initial hype, a lot of claims, grand claims that they'll change everything, but then the technology either disappears into irrelevance, it's not adopted, or it's simply overtaken very quickly by something else, a better technology or a countervailing technology. And the thing about emerging technologies, of course, is that they're still emerging, and so their capabilities aren't known. And I find in these conversations that it's very easy to just assume whatever we want about what new technologies are going to be able to do, but these assumptions need to be grounded in reality. And it's very easy to underestimate just how long it will take for those technologies either to come to fruition or to become widespread enough and widely adopted enough to really have an impact on the way that strategic affairs are conducted. And that's not to say that there aren't transformative technologies on the horizon, but I think we should at least be cautious before we jump to conclusions about just how much they're going to change the fundamentals of nuclear risk and stability. Another observation I'll make is that most technologies historically have a mix of stabilizing and destabilizing effects. Most technologies, or very few technologies, are strictly one or the other. And really, it might be a long time before we know which effect will dominate, stabilizing or destabilizing. I think of ballistic missiles as a good example of a technology with really differing effects on stability. On the one hand, ballistic missiles, when they emerged, were very destabilizing in some ways. You can't recall them once they're launched. They're very fast, so they force decision makers to make decisions about launching nuclear weapons very quickly, much more quickly than they had prior to the advent of ballistic missiles. So decision-making time is short, which tends toward crisis instability. It forces leaders to make decisions under extreme time pressure. On the other hand, ballistic missiles are very difficult to defend against. They can hit targets just about anywhere in the world, and that allows countries to practice deterrence by holding hostage things that an adversary values. And that really is the core of nuclear deterrence. So in that respect, ballistic missiles are very stabilizing because they force leaders to think twice about engaging in aggression. So new technology, but you have both stabilizing and destabilizing effects at the same time. I think one reason it's very difficult to determine the overall effect of a new technology on nuclear stability is that we often forget to consider countermeasures. Technological advancements are not a one-time final word. The technological improvement is a constant process of action and reaction. Somebody might deploy a new technology today that seems to have a huge effect on stability, and that might be rendered obsolete in a few years by either tactical changes or technological changes that are designed to offset that technological improvement. So I think we have to keep that in mind. Look, the big question is whether emerging technologies will strengthen or undermine nuclear stability and nuclear risk. Unfortunately, I'm not a fortune teller, and I cannot give you a definitive answer to that question. But what I can do is identify a couple of questions that I think we should keep in mind when we're thinking about specific new technologies or emerging technologies and what their effect on nuclear risks might be. One question that I think is important to keep in mind is how an emerging technology might make communication among leaders either easier or more difficult. Communication is crucial to crisis stability. I think we've seen this in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, in the case of U.S. leaders talking to their Russian counterparts to talk about nuclear risk and what each side's intentions are and are not. These kinds of meetings, face-to-face meetings, are crucial, and being able to communicate very quickly and in a credible way, I think, is very important to crisis stability. In terms of emerging technologies, I don't see a lot of risks here. To me, the trend lines are positive. Technology has made communication much easier, much more redundant, and much quicker than it ever has been in the past. And to me, that's a force in favor of crisis stability in general. A second factor I think we should think about is information. How does an emerging technology change the availability of information that leaders have at their disposal? Sometimes more information can be better for stability or improve stability. It allows leaders to clarify misperceptions. I think we're seeing this literally in real time in the case of this explosion that happened on the border of Poland. If this is an explosion that was an intentional Russian attack on Polish territory, that obviously has huge implications for the involvement of NATO in the conflict, how the United States and NATO should respond. But instead, what we're seeing is that very quickly, the United States and NATO have been apparently able to ascertain that this was not an intentional Russian attack. It was most likely a Ukrainian-fired missile, and being able to communicate that very quickly to the public, being able to ascertain that information and get it out there rapidly prevents this potential crisis from spiraling to a place where it might be unrecoverable. So in that sense, I think information is very valuable. Another good example is the supposed nuclear alert or the questionable nuclear alert that took place, or at least was ordered by Vladimir Putin early on in the war. If the United States had not been able to very closely monitor Russian nuclear assets and, again, quickly ascertained that this alert was not being accompanied by a movement of nuclear assets, removing warheads from shelters, putting nuclear submarines out to sea, all of those things the United States was able to determine very quickly those things were not happening, and that prevented, again, what could have been a major crisis from escalating. If the United States didn't have that information, again, enabled by technology, it might have felt compelled to respond in kind by increasing its own nuclear alert status, by deploying nuclear assets, and then we would be off somewhere else on the nuclear escalation ladder. And then the last thing I think we should think about when we think about emerging technologies is how they change decision-making time. I mentioned earlier that an example of ballistic missiles as a technology that really changed fundamentally the decision-making time that leaders had available to them. Hypersonic missiles are also often put into this category. And here is where I think emerging technologies really could be potentially dangerous by creating more pressure, even more than leaders have now, to decide very quickly whether they need to deploy assets, increase their alert status, or even use nuclear weapons for fear of coming under an attack that would decapitate or disable their nuclear assets. I'll just say one final thing, which is, I think it's important to note that these factors can, again, have countervailing effects. Information in a crisis can be stabilizing if it's information about moves that your opponent or your adversary is not making, but it can also be destabilizing. If your adversary, for example, has greater information available to them about the location of your nuclear assets and can find your nuclear submarines out at sea, that increases their vulnerability and creates pressure on you to make decisions very quickly about what to do with them. And in a crisis, that can be destabilizing. So we shouldn't think about these factors as strictly positives or negatives, but I think they are core components of nuclear risk and nuclear stability, especially in a crisis. And to the extent that emerging technologies shape them or change them, then they can also have an impact on nuclear risk. So I'll stop there and thank you again, and I look forward to our discussion.
Fantastic, thank you. I think you made several great points, but what I'm particularly interested in asking you about is you talked about how obviously emerging technologies can have negative or positive effects on risk and on stability. This is a rather open-ended question, and you don't have to have a perfect answer for this, but I am curious, do we think that emerging technologies have more impact before a crisis has even started or during a crisis? I have my thoughts on this, but I would be curious on yours. Is really those effects, are they most felt in times of, say, competition but not crisis than they are in times of crisis?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I think it's clear that they shape both things. Prior to a crisis, right, they shape leaders' decisions by shaping capabilities, by shaping information they have about opportunities and about what their adversaries might be doing. During a crisis, technologies, again, shape the information that leaders have available to them. They shape decision-making time. I think it's hard to separate the two, but both prior to and during a crisis, I think technology is really quite critical.
I agree. I do think, at least, and maybe this is just a bit of my bias because I've been working and following the war in Ukraine, but I do find it's interesting how many of the sort of coined revolutionary systems that we spend so much time talking about and debating about and researching during peacetime don't actually get that much play in crisis. And I've been in the interesting position over the past year. I started my career researching the Russian military, and I remember the sort of panic that we had on this side of the Atlantic about the T-14. And so as I was watching the war play out this year, I was struck by the few T-14s that we saw on the battlefield and how those big fears that drove not a lot, but not insignificant amount of planning in the 2010s didn't materialize in the way we anticipated. But so just
I think, again, one thing I'll say to that is the process of technological adoption historically is a slow one. Very rarely do new technologies emerge fully capable and then are instantly adopted into military or defense planning. These technologies are confronting organizations that have their patterns, their routines, their investment tracks, and their habits. And sometimes they're compatible, but very often they're not. And it takes a long time for these technologies to be adopted in a way that it can really shape the way that crises are conducted and resolved.
Absolutely. And then Dina, I will turn to you. I saw your hands up. And there's a sort of certainly non-linearity, but also just technologies come and go. I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union were very keen on cruise missiles, for example, at the start of the Cold War. Those were abandoned in the middle and latter parts of the Cold War. And now we are revisiting cruise missiles as a tool of significant geopolitical power. So that's a very good lesson to keep in mind. Dmitry.
Yeah, thanks. Just like a couple of points, because I very much like what was just said by Dr. Sechser. Another example to cruise missiles and how organizational patterns might be a problem, might be a hurdle to introduction of new weapons is basically loitering munitions, because, well, no major military have introduced them in such numbers as the Iranians or the North Koreans. And Israeli as a notable exception. But I would also like to mention one example where technology plays both ways, not explicitly in risk reduction, but more in the arms control as a type of risk reduction, is the very same technology that helped and continues to help Russia and the US to be more or less sure about the compliance with New START treaty, despite the absence of inspections for these or other reasons. And basically the robust space-based ISR capabilities, the so-called National Technical Means. The very same technology basically killed the Open Skies Treaty for US and Russia because, well, the Americans, for all good reasons, decided they no longer need overflights on aircraft because they have such a fancy satellite constellation. And I think it is a very good example. It is not a positive one, but still it perfectly shows that the very same capability can decrease risk and can basically destroy the risk reduction mechanism that was in place. And as a very small comment on this increased combat readiness that is sometimes called on the hate and combat alert for nuclear forces that was deployed in Russia in spring, basically it turned out to be just increase the command and control capability, like increased manning of command posts and things like that. And I'm not sure that everyone noticed, but I think in August at some of the public events, US Strategic Command officers basically acknowledged that they've responded in kind. They've also had increased the flight hours for the airborne command posts and things like that. And, well, they didn't make a big deal out of that. And I totally agree that the overall again, robustness of information that is being acquired by major powers, it helps not to overreact from time to time. Yeah, and sorry for taking so much time. I'm looking forward to like 10 minutes of our discussion.
No, that's great. And I appreciate the examples. I think one thing I am particularly fond of in this field is when we can get into the historical examples and have, more concrete context to work with. But I do want to take this moment and say to the participants, please send any questions you have using the Q&A function. And then Dmitry, I appreciate your pivot to organizational patterns. And Dr. Zhao, I'd like to talk to you about organizational patterns in crisis communication in China. So I'm always very interested in the Chinese approach to crisis communications because China has quite a few hotlines. It has hotlines with Taiwan. It has hotlines with some countries that don't have nuclear weapons in the region. It has ways of communicating with the US, and yet there continues to be some unhappy comments from the US side of things that Americans are not able to reach their Chinese counterparts. So what is the approach to crisis communications? How is it informed by the lack of historical communication relations in terms of arms control and notifications that the US and Russia has? How does it manifest in the US-China relationship?
Oh, first of all, I think one of the major obstacles is again different views about the sources of risk. And China genuinely believe that, well, it's US, flying their military aircrafts close to Chinese coast. It's the US military vessels that come close to China's water that increase the risk of military accidents, right? So it doesn't make sense for China to make it safe for the U.S. to continue doing so. That's not reacting, not responding to requests of using hotlines or to have timely communication. Sometimes it's just the Chinese way to put pressure on the U.S. in the hope that the growing risk would eventually convince the United States that its military behaviors are not worth it. And it's for the U.S. to change its military behavior that would fundamentally lower the risk, if that's really what U.S. worries about. Second, I think the obstacle is, again, coming from inside. The party controls the gun. I don't think there is full trust in the military from the political leadership for them to just talk with their American counterparts in a crisis. I think they emphasize the importance of a procedure. In the China-U.S. defense telephone link reportedly goes through Zhongnanhai, right? That's where the Chinese political leadership reside. So, and there is a telecommunication directorate at Zhongnanhai that has the choice of whether to put through the American call to the Chinese Defense Ministry. So there is always this emphasis on party control of the military that makes it hard for Chinese military officials to just pick up the phone and talk to his or her American counterpart. And this trend, I think, is going to become stronger over time as under Mr. Xi, China continues to centralize domestic decision making. And Xi's domestic authority becomes even more absolute and unquestionable. So that even further reduces the incentive of the military leaders to just talk to Americans without getting approval first. The thing is, I think it sometimes just takes time for China to gradually appreciate the importance of timely and effective crisis communication. Yes, China went through a crisis with Soviet Union in 1969, but still, in general, compared with the US and Russia, China has experienced much fewer serious military crises, especially nuclear crises. Chinese political leaders still appear to believe that they can be in good control in a crisis. And again, because of this lack of experience, I think that partly accounts for Chinese distrust and genuine suspicion about the utility of crisis communication, whether the enemy would abuse the hotline and use it to spread disinformation in a crisis to mislead China, right? There are many American military officials who have this suspicion about China misusing the hotline. And trust me, there is even greater Chinese suspicion. And it will take time, I think, for China to gradually build that appreciation about the mechanism of crisis communication, about the technology involved in this communication, and for China to gradually work out its internal procedure that can facilitate a more timely correspondence in a crisis between, at the military level.
I think, Dmitry, you have something that you want to mention on this.
A very short comment on that. One example about organizational hurdles with regard to risk reduction mechanisms with China is that, to those who don't know, there is an agreement on notification about ballistic missile and space launch vehicle launches between Russia and China, which is limited in directions where missiles and rockets fly and so on, but still there is a notification mechanism, and it has an explicit provision that both sides should like decide what will be the entity within their governments who will be in charge of exchanging notifications. And in Russian case, it's relatively simple. We have Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which was established back in the day together with the Americans, while in the US it's in the State Department. In Russia, it is a department of the Ministry of Defense, but still there is an organizational entity. I spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out what is the corresponding entity in the Chinese government and failed. So probably it is just something ad hoc, where just basically people who are in charge of international military cooperation send the notifications prepared by someone else and receive this notification, and that's all. And this is, from my perspective, it is a serious problem with, again, institutionalizing the risk reduction with China and with other countries, because nuclear risk reduction centers are not very common thing even among nuclear weapon states. And sorry for abusing your time.
No, this is wonderful. I enjoy these sorts of exchanges.
Can I jump in on this also?
Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, I think that, this is such an important point that Tong made, which was that learning has to take place. And when we think about the US and Soviet experience with nuclear risk, I think it is really hard to overstate just how dangerous and stressful the initial spate of nuclear crises was between those two countries. Obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also the US nuclear alert in 1969, the nuclear alert again in 1973 during the Middle East War. These are all cases where leaders came to realize, and it happened gradually, not instantly, but they came to realize that they didn't have complete control over their military forces, no matter how much they wish they did. Some orders won't be followed. Actions will be taken without their knowledge or approval. They don't have complete information about what's happening in the crisis, and accidents happen despite their best efforts to prevent them. And it was those realizations through, hard experience and genuine risks that created genuine danger that convinced the US and the Soviets that reducing nuclear risk and improving communications during a crisis was necessary. I don't think China has had quite the same experience with nuclear crises that created quite the same level of danger. Obviously, there's 1969, but I don't think really there's anything quite equivalent to, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis in recent Chinese history that would make that lesson quite so tangible and quite so apparent for Chinese leaders. And the question is whether it will take a major crisis for them to realize that communication and risk reduction is important, or whether they can learn by osmosis through somebody else's experience.
Absolutely. No, I think that's an excellent point. And on the learning curve thing, I think we often look back on the Cold War and we see the wonderful scholarship that came out of it, some of which is on the bookshelf behind me. But by the end of the Cold War, I'm fairly confident in saying the American experts on the Soviet Union and then Russia were very well informed, and vice versa. And that was not how things started out after the Second World War. At the start of the Cold War, there was a mad rush, certainly in the US, to suddenly, have more people who can speak and read Russian, have better understanding of Russian and Soviet history. That sort of understanding of historical strategy and strategic viewpoints does not come immediately. That required a significant amount of measures and a insignificant amount of money and personnel, and we just don't have that yet. There's not a huge amount of US experts who are incredibly well-versed in historical Chinese strategy. There's not a lot of them that speak Chinese. It is just very nascent in that way. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. There's not that sort of understanding of each other yet. And I do think Dr. Zhao's point on China being very reticent to use communications when it comes to being within their own sphere. And that's a really interesting dynamic to pull out, because if you look at the use of the hotline in the US-Russian history, sure, it came about after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was used in some cases for incidents that was very pertinent to either Russia or the US. But a lot of its use happens when you could get sort of out of those spheres, out of those homelands. So a lot of the hotline use happened during the Middle East wars in the 60s and 70s. Particularly during Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. I do think there's maybe something to the idea that there's a little bit more comfort in communicating and showing one's moves a bit more once you get away from your own territory. Dr. Sechser, was that a hand up? Oh, no, sorry. Well, I recognize that we're a little bit over time. I appreciate everyone giving us their time, their morning, their afternoon, their evening in Moscow, I believe. So thank you so much. I would love for this event to go on for 2 more hours, but unfortunately, I will not be able to make that happen. So thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for coming in. It's been a wonderful way to kick off my morning. I have so many thoughts coming out of this. Maybe we'll do some follow-on events, but I think at its core, we're in a rather fascinating age, for better or for worse. And there's lots of new technologies, and sort of looking out and realizing that the next 10 years will be very fascinating, and seeing both the crisis communication and risk reduction avenue with Russia, which has been well established, but is sort of at a rather critical point given the past year, and also the sort of arms control failures that we've seen over the past decade. And then on the other side, seeing the path with China, which is so nascent, so undefined in terms of communication, interactions, and all of that. And it might be a little bit ridiculous to say, but I'm curious to see what happens. And I will likely refer to these 3 experts again as blips and issues pop up along the way. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to the participants, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.